The discovery came like a thunderclap, sudden and irreversible, as if the heavens themselves conspired to tear away the veil that had obscured the truth for so long. It wasn't a single moment of revelation, but a slow, steady accumulation of the smallest details, each one like a note in a song that, when pieced together, formed an unbearable crescendo. It began on an ordinary morning like so many others when I first noticed the strange emptiness in the room. The light from the early morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor. My wife, Julia, had already gone to work, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of the house. I had never been one to question our routine. There was comfort in the predictability of it. We'd built a life, a partnership, a semblance of harmony. Yet, as I sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Could I be imagining it? I wondered, tracing my fingers along the rim of the mug. But the feeling clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. I should have known. Looking back, I can see the signs, the tiny things that didn't seem important at the time. The way she no longer lingered in our conversations, her thoughts seemingly elsewhere. The distracted glances, the muted smiles. Her clothes, once carefully chosen, now seemed more like a hastily put-together afterthought. The perfume that had once been hers, the one that had clung to the collar of her shirts, reminding me of the days when she was truly mine, had begun to smell unfamiliar, faintly floral in a way that didn't belong to her. But it was the phone, that cursed device. That would be the unraveling of everything. I had never been one to pry. Our relationship, I thought, was built on trust. She trusts me, I'd tell myself, and I trust her. But one evening, as I walked past the couch where she had left it, the screen lit up with a message. The name on it wasn't one I recognized. A first name, no last name, a casual familiarity in the words that sent a spike of discomfort into my chest. "Hey, what time will you be home tonight? I'm thinking of you." It wasn't the words that were so startling, but the tone, the flirtation, the intimacy that had no place in our marriage. It was the first crack in the facade, the first moment where I allowed myself to feel the fissures forming, hidden beneath the surface. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but my hand moved without my consent, picking up the phone. The message was old, several days, maybe weeks, but the damage had already been done. My heart raced as I set the phone back down, my breath shallow and uneven. What do I do now? My mind spiraled, a torrent of emotions crashing through me. Why hadn't I seen this? Was I blind to the signs? Or had I simply chosen not to see? I didn't confront her immediately. No. I had to know more. It wasn't just about the message. It was about everything that had led me to this point, everything that had felt off but had gone unspoken. I had to gather the pieces, confirm my suspicions before I let myself fall into the abyss of confrontation. I started with the phone, of course. I didn't want to, but I did it. The thought of violating her privacy burned me, but the fire of betrayal in my chest was far hotter, and I knew that no matter how much I fought it, I needed the truth. Her messages were like a wound opening, each text, each photo, each call. History, a fresh wound. There were more names, more unknowns, each one more intimate than the last. A colleague, a friend? I asked myself, though deep down, I knew the answer. The conversations grew more suggestive, more secretive. The last message I saw made my stomach twist painfully. "Can't wait to see you again. Last time was incredible. Can we do it again this week?" I felt sick to my core. Every inch of my body screamed at me to look away, to stop reading, but I couldn't. I had to know. Why? Why didn't she just tell me? The questions echoed in my mind, as real and tangible as the ache in my chest. Had it been going on for years? Had I been so blind? And then, just like that, the anger came, Quiet at first, a smoldering ember in my gut, but it quickly grew, a firestorm of rage that threatened to consume me. How could she? How could she betray me like this? I had to confront her. But I couldn't do it just yet. I couldn't face her until I had a plan, until I had everything laid bare before me. I felt my hands tremble as I looked down at the screen of her phone. The weight of the truth was heavy, suffocating even. I could feel it pressing in on me from all sides, making it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly. And yet, despite the flood of emotions coursing through me, hurt, betrayal, confusion, rage, there was something else. A strange clarity, a sharp edge to my thoughts that hadn't been there before. The truth was like a blade, and I had been holding it in my hand all this time. The days that followed the discovery were a blur. Every moment felt like I was walking on a knife's edge, the raw sting of betrayal searing through my veins, poisoning every thought. I kept going through the motions of our life, making breakfast, going to work, speaking to Julia. But inside, I was a different man. The quiet rage was constant, simmering beneath the surface, pushing me further from the person I used to be. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. The warmth in her voice felt like a lie, the touch of her hand on mine nothing more than an uncomfortable reminder of the mask she wore. Every smile she gave me, every kiss on the cheek, only fed the fire of resentment. And yet I stayed silent, letting the distance between us grow until there was an ocean between us, vast and impassable. It wasn't until one fateful evening, late, after she had returned from work, that the storm finally broke. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in, her face tired, her eyes distracted. She looked at me briefly, the faintest flicker of guilt in her gaze, before it was quickly hidden behind the practiced mask of indifference. Her words came out in a casual hum, as if everything were perfectly normal. "Hey, how was your day?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. My eyes narrowed, studying her as though I were a stranger trying to read her for the first time. "Who are you now?" I wanted to ask. "Who are you, and what have you become?" The silence between us grew thick, suffocating. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. I wasn't sure whether I was more afraid of what I might say or what she might confess. I finally spoke, my voice low, controlled, but there was an undercurrent to it, something darker lurking beneath the surface. "You've been seeing someone else." She froze. Her hand, which had been idly playing with a piece of paper on the table, stilled. Her breath hitched, a slight tremor in her lips as she looked up at me. The facade cracked just for a moment, but long enough for me to see the truth flash across her face. Guilt, fear, shame. It was all I needed. The words came out before I could stop them, sharp and biting. "How long, Julia?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. "How long have you been lying to me?" Her eyes darted away, her gaze falling to the table. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the words that would explain what couldn't be explained. Her silence was the confirmation I needed. I had thought I was prepared for this moment. I had thought I could maintain control, hold on to the calm and rational part of me. But when I saw her crumble under the weight of my gaze, something inside me snapped. I was no longer the man who had loved her. I was the man she had betrayed, the man who had been shattered by her lies. I want revenge. The thought slipped into my mind like a dark whisper, a voice that had been dormant, waiting for its moment. And now I heard it clearly, with an intensity that felt like fire running through my veins. "I want you to leave," I said, my voice colder than I intended. But there was no turning back now. "I want you to leave, and don't come back." Her face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her mouth opened, and I could see the words forming, the desperate pleas she was about to make, but I held up my hand, cutting her off. "No," I said, my voice a final, unyielding command. "I've had enough." She stepped back, her body trembling. "Please, let's talk about this." "No," I repeated, my hand clenched into a fist by my side. "There's nothing to talk about. You've made your choice." She stood there for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. And then, as if defeated by the weight of her own guilt, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the house. I didn't feel relief. No, there was something darker inside me, a satisfaction that twisted in my gut, making me feel powerful for the first time in days. She was gone. She was out. And yet, the taste in my mouth was bitter, like ash. But my mind, still clouded by rage, wouldn't allow me to rest. I wanted more. It wasn't enough to simply send her away. I needed her to understand. I needed her to feel the weight of what she had done, to feel the same emptiness that had consumed me since that first glimpse of her betrayal. Revenge. The thought burned brighter, sharper now, urging me forward. I knew what I had to do. I didn't call her. I didn't send a text. I waited, and when she came back to collect her things, to face the consequences of her actions, I had prepared my response. I didn't give her what she expected. Instead, I made sure that when she saw me again, when she faced me once more, the days that followed the discovery were a blur. Every moment felt like I was walking on a knife's edge, the raw sting of betrayal searing through my veins, poisoning every thought. I kept going through the motions of our life, making breakfast, going to work, speaking to Julia. But inside, I was a different man. The quiet rage was constant, simmering beneath the surface, pushing me further from the person I used to be. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. The warmth in her voice felt like a lie, the touch of her hand on mine nothing more than an uncomfortable reminder of the mask she wore. Every smile she gave me, every kiss on the cheek, only fed the fire of resentment. And yet I stayed silent, letting the distance between us grow until there was an ocean between us, vast and impassable. It wasn't until one fateful evening, late, after she had returned from work, that the storm finally broke. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I came in, her face tired, her eyes distracted. She looked at me briefly, the faintest flicker of guilt in her gaze, before it was quickly hidden behind the practiced mask of indifference. Her words came out in a casual hum, as if everything were perfectly normal. "Hey, how was your day?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. My eyes narrowed, studying her as though I were a stranger trying to read her for the first time. "Who are you now?" I wanted to ask. "Who are you, and what have you become?" The silence between us grew thick, suffocating. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. I wasn't sure whether I was more afraid of what I might say or what she might confess. I finally spoke, my voice low, controlled, but there was an undercurrent to it, something darker lurking beneath the surface. "You've been seeing someone else." She froze. Her hand, which had been idly playing with a piece of paper on the table, stilled. Her breath hitched, a slight tremor in her lips as she looked up at me. The facade cracked just for a moment, but long enough for me to see the truth flash across her face. Guilt, fear, shame. It was all I needed. The words came out before I could stop them, sharp and biting. "How long, Julia?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. "How long have you been lying to me?" Her eyes darted away, her gaze falling to the table. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the words that would explain what couldn't be explained. Her silence was the confirmation I needed. I had thought I was prepared for this moment. I had thought I could maintain control, hold on to the calm and rational part of me. But when I saw her crumble under the weight of my gaze, something inside me snapped. I was no longer the man who had loved her. I was the man she had betrayed, the man who had been shattered by her lies. I want revenge. The thought slipped into my mind like a dark whisper, a voice that had been dormant, waiting for its moment. And now I heard it clearly, with an intensity that felt like fire running through my veins. "I want you to leave," I said, my voice colder than I intended. But there was no turning back now. "I want you to leave, and don't come back." Her face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Her mouth opened, and I could see the words forming, the desperate pleas she was about to make, but I held up my hand, cutting her off. "No," I said, my voice a final, unyielding command. "I've had enough." She stepped back, her body trembling. "Please, let's talk about this." "No," I repeated, my hand clenched into a fist by my side. "There's nothing to talk about. You've made your choice." She stood there for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. And then, as if defeated by the weight of her own guilt, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the house. I didn't feel relief. No, there was something darker inside me, a satisfaction that twisted in my gut, making me feel powerful for the first time in days. She was gone. She was out. And yet, the taste in my mouth was bitter, like ash. But my mind, still clouded by rage, wouldn't allow me to rest. I wanted more. It wasn't enough to simply send her away. I needed her to understand. I needed her to feel the weight of what she had done, to feel the same emptiness that had consumed me since that first glimpse of her betrayal. Revenge. The thought burned brighter, sharper now, urging me forward. I knew what I had to do. I didn't call her. I didn't send a text. I waited, and when she came back to collect her things, to face the consequences of her actions, I had prepared my response. I didn't give her what she expected. Instead, I made sure that when she saw me again, when she faced me once more, the silence in the house felt heavier after she left. I had expected a sense of triumph, a vindication that would soothe the raw ache of betrayal. But instead, all I felt was emptiness, an absence that stretched out like an ocean, deep and endless. I had done what I needed to do, the revenge, the retribution. It was all in my hands now, and yet I found myself standing in the midst of it, wondering if this was all there was. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if even the walls were mourning. The sound of her departure lingered in the air like the echo of a thunderclap that hadn't quite faded. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind, the look on her face when she saw the evidence of her betrayal, the way her body seemed to shrink under the weight of her guilt. There was no denial, no defense. She knew what she had done, and I had made her face it. I ran my hand through my hair, feeling the tension in my neck, the tightness in my chest. My body was a collection of bruises, invisible to anyone else but painfully clear to me. She was gone, but the anger, the pain, it still twisted inside. Me like a knot that refused to untangle. The revenge I thought would free me only seemed to deepen the wound. I paced around the house, unable to settle. Every step seemed to echo in the empty rooms, reminding me of the life we had once shared. I went to the living room, where we had spent so many evenings together, and stopped in front of the fireplace. The memories were sharp, almost painful. Her laughter, the way she would curl up next to me on the couch, her hand warm against mine. How had it all gone wrong, I thought, the question lingering like an uninvited guest. I could almost hear her voice, like a whisper in the back of my mind. "It wasn't like that, I swear," I imagined her saying. But it was, I reminded myself. It was exactly like that. She had betrayed me, and no amount of apology could undo the damage. No amount of remorse could ever erase the years I had wasted, the trust that had been broken. I didn't want to think about her anymore. I didn't want to dwell on what we had lost, on the lies she had told me. And yet my thoughts kept circling back, always returning to that singular painful truth. She had never truly loved me the way I had loved her. But I couldn't let it end like this. I couldn't let her walk away with nothing, as if she hadn't torn my world apart. She had to understand the depth of her betrayal. She had to feel it. I made my decision that night as I stood in the quiet darkness of the house, staring at the photos that hung on the walls. Memories of a time when everything had seemed right. She would know. I would make sure of it. The next day, I began to plan. I couldn't just let her leave, thinking she had won, thinking she had escaped without consequence. No, I would make her pay, in a way that was more than just words, more than the silence I had forced upon her. I would take what she had stolen from me. I started with her things. I packed up the few belongings she had left in the house, the clothes, the books, the personal items that now felt foreign in my hands. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with them, but they couldn't remain here, reminders of her presence, of the lies she had woven around me. I drove to her apartment that evening, the box of her things sitting in the passenger seat. And as I parked in front of the building, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I hadn't been back here since the day I found out, since the day I realized that she had been living a double life. I wasn't sure what I expected. Perhaps to see her with him, perhaps to feel a flash of something, anything, that would tell me I had made the right choice. But when I walked into the lobby of the building, I found nothing but an overwhelming emptiness. The elevator ride to her floor felt long, agonizingly slow. I stood there, gripping the box in my hands, my mind running through every scenario. Would she be there? Would she beg me to come back? Or would she finally see the full measure of what she had done to me? The door to her apartment opened without hesitation, the key I had kept from all those years ago still working. When I stepped inside, I was met with the quiet, sterile feel of a place that no longer felt like home, just a hollow shell. The furniture was the same, the pictures on the walls untouched, yet everything felt different. It was as though she had abandoned it in pieces, leaving behind only the remnants of what had once been. I placed the box down on the counter, the sound of it thudding against the surface louder than I had anticipated. It was final. The last piece of her life with me was now in this box, and with it, my role as the betrayed husband was over. I left, without saying a word, leaving the door open behind me, the promise of what had been lost echoing in the empty hallway. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The days after I dropped off her things at her apartment were long and quiet, punctuated by the sound of my own thoughts gnawing at me, relentless and unyielding. I had expected more, closure perhaps, or a sense of peace. But all I found was an aching void, a numbness that settled deep within my bones. I had seen her once more, faced her with the truth of her betrayal, and yet it felt like no weight had been lifted, no burden removed. The silence in my house was deafening, louder than any argument or confrontation could have been. I tried to keep busy. I threw myself into my work, focused on meaningless tasks just to fill the void. But it was impossible to escape the shadow of what had happened. Every corner of the house reminded me of her laugh, her touch, the way she would lay her head on my shoulder at night, as if everything were right in the world. How could I have been so blind? I thought to myself, unable to let go of the question. It was then that I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. Revenge had not freed me. It had only deepened the wound. The truth, the act of unmasking her, had been necessary, but it hadn't brought me the justice I thought it would. I was still angry, but more than that, I was lost. What now? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. I had taken action. I had shown her the weight of her betrayal. But what had it accomplished? A few moments of discomfort, perhaps, but nothing lasting. She had been shaken by my words, but she would recover. She would move on. She had moved on long before I had even realized what was happening. I couldn't stand the thought of her continuing on with her life, with him, without any real consequence. It gnawed at me. How easily she could move forward, how she could slip away from the life we had built together as if it were nothing. I wasn't done. No, I was not finished. I needed more. But this time I realized something deeper. This wasn't about making her feel the same pain I had felt. That wasn't going to heal me. This was about making her regret. There was a fire that burned inside me now, something sharper than before. I wasn't going to let her leave without truly seeing the consequences of what she had done. I wasn't going to let her think that she had gotten away with it. I began to gather information. I didn't need to do this. I could have walked away, let her have her life, let her go on. But there was something inside me, a primal need for retribution. That wouldn't let me let go. So I started small, watching from the shadows, staying hidden, observing. I followed her carefully for a few days. The places she went, the people she saw. She had moved on, yes, but so had I. The difference was, I didn't need anyone to fill the hole she had left. She, on the other hand, had found someone else to fill hers. And there it was, the man. The one who had taken my place. The one who had stepped into the life I thought I still shared with her. His name was Sam. I hadn't known much about him, but now I had time to study him. I watched him from a distance, piecing together his habits, his routine, the way he spoke to her, the way he touched her. It disgusted me. I couldn't stop watching them. Every touch, every shared glance felt like a blade, stabbing deeper with each passing day. I started digging. I used everything I knew. Contacts, old acquaintances, the shadows I had learned to hide in over the years. It wasn't hard to find out more about Sam. He wasn't anything special, just a man who had slipped into her life unnoticed while I had been blind. I found out where he worked, his background, his connections. I made sure I knew exactly who he was and what he did. The more I learned, the more I saw the cracks in their relationship. The small things that told me he wasn't the perfect man she thought he was. And then it hit me. The final act. The piece of the puzzle I had been searching for. I had spent so much time focusing on her and him, trying to make her feel the betrayal I had felt, but the truth was, the one who needed to feel the sting of, my revenge was not just her, it was him. I had a plan. One that would leave both of them shaken to their core, one that would make them question everything they had built. I didn't need to hurt them physically, no. I would hurt them in the one way that would make them feel my rage. I was going to destroy his trust in her. I made a call, a simple one, but it would set the wheels in motion. I knew just the right person, a woman, someone who had worked with Sam in the past. I played my part, carefully crafting a story of an affair, a secret he didn't know about. I fed her the lies, made sure every detail was convincing enough to get under his skin. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. I watched from the shadows as Sam's world began to crumble. He didn't know what was happening at first. The doubt crept in slowly, a seed planted. I thought it was over. I thought that the destruction I had left behind would be enough to end the cycle, to sever the thread that bound us together in this twisted, painful mess. Julia's betrayal had been exposed, her lover's trust in her dismantled, and the life we had once shared reduced to ashes. But betrayal has a way of lingering, like the shadow of a storm that refuses to pass. It wasn't over. Not yet. Months passed. I poured myself into rebuilding my life, brick by brick. Therapy sessions became my sanctuary, where I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Friends, the ones who had stood by me, reminded me that there was life beyond her, beyond the pain, and slowly, I began to believe it. But then, one night, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the late hour made my chest tighten. I hesitated before answering, the weight of intuition pressing down on me. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my tone. Is this Mark?" A woman's voice, trembling, barely above a whisper. "Yes. Who's this?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should, before she spoke again. "My name's Allison. I think we need to talk about Julia." My heart sank. The name hit me like a blow to the chest, knocking the air out of me. I hadn't spoken to Julia since the night I left her things at her apartment. I had tried to move on, to bury the memories of her infidelity and focus on healing. But now, her name hung in the air like a ghost, pulling me back into the darkness. "What about her?" I asked, my voice sharp, defensive. "She's seeing my husband," Allison said, her voice cracking with emotion. "And I think she's been seeing him for a while." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words didn't make sense. How could she do this again? After everything? My mind raced, trying to piece together the implications, the timeline. But the more I thought about it, the more the truth became undeniable. Julia hadn't changed. She had simply found someone else to fill the void. "I thought you should know," Allison continued, her voice trembling, because I think she's done this before." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "Oh, you have no idea." Over the next hour, Allison and I pieced together the fragments of our lives, comparing notes, timelines, and the lies we had both been fed. It was uncanny how similar our stories were, how Julia's patterns had repeated themselves, with chilling precision. She had met Allison's husband, Greg, at a networking event 6 months ago, the same time she had been fighting to salvage her relationship with Sam. She had played the same game, using the same charm, weaving the same web of deceit. The anger I had buried began to resurface, sharper and more potent than before. I had thought I was done with her, that I had left her betrayal behind. But now I realized that she hadn't just betrayed me. She had betrayed everyone who had ever believed in her, everyone who had ever loved her. And she wasn't going to stop. The next few days were a blur. Allison and I kept in touch, sharing every detail we uncovered. I found myself returning to the habits I thought I had abandoned, digging through social media, tracking movements, piecing together evidence. It felt obsessive, but I couldn't stop. I needed to see it, to know for certain. And then, one evening, I saw them. I had driven to a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, a place Julia had always loved for its secluded charm. I wasn't sure why I went there. Maybe part of me hoped she wouldn't show up, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But when I saw her walk in, her hand casually brushing against Greg's arm, I felt the familiar sting of betrayal all over again. They looked so comfortable, so at ease, as if nothing else in the world mattered. Greg laughed at something she said, his face lighting up with a warmth that made my stomach churn. I wanted to confront them, to march over and expose them right there in front of everyone, but I didn't. I stayed in the shadows, watching, letting the weight of the scene settle over me. When they left, I followed. Not closely enough to be noticed, but enough to see where they were headed. And when they disappeared into the entrance of a small boutique hotel, I knew I had all the confirmation I needed. The fury that burned inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the lies she had built her life on, the destruction she left in her wake. And this time, I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. I went home that night and began to plan, not for revenge, not for some petty act of retribution, but for justice. Julia had hurt too many people, left too many lives in ruins. It was time for the truth to come out, for everyone to see her for who she truly was. This time, I wasn't going to let her hide in the shadows. The moment I decided to dig deeper into Julia's betrayal, a sense of grim determination settled over me. If she thought she could weave another web of deceit and escape unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. This time, I would unravel her lies thread by thread until the entire facade collapsed. I started with the basics. The first step was to confirm how far her deception had spread. Allison, Greg's wife, was an unwitting ally in this effort. Together, we shared our findings, messages, timelines, behaviors. It was like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, each revelation fitting perfectly into the bigger picture of Julia's double life. The breadcrumbs of betrayal. The clues were everywhere once I knew where to look. Julia had always been meticulous, but her confidence had made her careless. I revisited her social media accounts looking for patterns, likes, comments, locations, tagged too often to be coincidence. Her posts seemed innocuous on the surface, but there were gaps, inconsistencies that hinted at something more. A dinner she claimed was with coworkers, but no one else had shared photos. A weekend girls' trip that didn't line up with her bank statements. Then there was her phone. I had avoided prying into her private messages during our marriage, but now I had no such reservations. I couldn't access her current phone, but I still had an old backup saved on my laptop. Digging through the files was both painful and infuriating. There were no explicit messages, but there were plenty of veiled references, inside jokes, conversations ending abruptly as if continued elsewhere, moments of intimacy that didn't belong to me. Following the trail, Greg, her newest conquest, was a creature of habit. A quick search revealed his workplace, his routines, and even his gym schedule. Allison was instrumental here. Her access to Greg's accounts gave us insight into his movements. Bank transactions, emails, and calendar entries painted a picture of a man who was as predictable as clockwork. Using this information, I began tailing them. Discreetly, of course. It wasn't difficult. Julia's car was distinctive, and her favorite haunts hadn't changed much. I followed them to restaurants, bars, even a park where they strolled hand in hand like a couple from a rom-com. Each time I documented everything, photos, videos, timestamps. Every detail was another nail in the coffin of her lies. The network expands. As the days passed, I started reaching out to people who might have insights into Julia's life. Old friends, former colleagues, anyone who could shed light on her patterns. Many were hesitant to talk, either out of loyalty or discomfort, but others opened up once I shared my suspicions. I discovered something chilling. Greg wasn't the only man she had been involved with since our marriage ended. There were others, brief flings mostly, but enough to establish a pattern. Julia wasn't just unfaithful, she was a serial deceiver, addicted to the thrill of secrecy and the power it gave her. The turning point. The more I learned, the more I realized this wasn't just about me or Allison. Julia's actions had ripple effects, leaving pain and betrayal in their wake. She had lied to everyone, friends, family, even herself. And yet, she continued, as if the truth didn't matter, as if the damage she caused was inconsequential. It was time to confront her, but not privately, not quietly. Julia had lived in the shadows for too long, and I was determined to drag her into the light. I planned meticulously. I gathered all the evidence, photos, messages, statements from others she had wronged. I compiled everything into a digital dossier, organized and irrefutable. Then I set the stage for the final act, a confrontation that would force her to face the truth she had so carefully avoided. The opportunity came during a gathering of mutual friends, a casual dinner party where Julia would least expect it. I made sure Allison was there, along with a few others who had been affected by Julia's deceit. As the evening progressed, I waited, letting the conversation flow naturally until the moment was right. When it came, it was like a thunderclap. "I think we need to talk about the truth, Julia," I said, my voice calm but firm. The room fell silent. Julia froze, her glass halfway to her lips, her eyes darting nervously around the table. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning innocence. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I pulled out my phone, casting the first image onto the screen for everyone to see. A photo of Julia and Greg at the boutique hotel. Gasps echoed around the room as I began to speak, recounting every detail of her betrayal, every lie she had told, every life she had touched with her deception. Her facade crumbled as the evidence piled up. She tried to deny it at first, then deflect, but there was no escape. The people in that room saw her for who she truly was, and for the first time, she couldn't hide behind charm. Revenge for betrayal. The final reckoning. The confrontation at the dinner party had been a storm, but the calm that followed wasn't as satisfying as I'd imagined. Julia's humiliation was visible, her carefully constructed facade shattered in front of our mutual friends. But I realized something as I watched her leave that night. Exposing her lies wasn't enough. The pain she caused, the ripple effect of her betrayal, demanded more than just public shame. It demanded a reckoning. I wasn't seeking revenge for its own sake. This wasn't about petty vengeance. It was about accountability, about making her feel for the first time the weight of the destruction she left in her wake. Julia had manipulated, lied, and cheated her way through life, leaving a trail of broken hearts and shattered trust. If she thought she could walk away from it all unscathed, she was wrong. Step 1. Financial ruin. Julia prided herself on her independence, her success, and her reputation as a savvy businesswoman. It was her Achilles heel, the one part of her life where she hadn't been able to manipulate her way to the top. She had worked hard to build her career, but in doing so, she had left vulnerabilities, ones I knew how to exploit. I started small, digging into her professional life. Old contacts, colleagues, and even her ex-bosses provided a wealth of information. Julia had a habit of cutting corners, bending rules just enough to stay under the radar. But her arrogance had led her to make mistakes. Financial discrepancies, inappropriate relationships, and deals that skirted ethical boundaries. With Allison's help, I compiled a report that detailed everything. Then, I sent it anonymously to her current employer and a few industry watchdogs. It wasn't long before whispers started circulating. Julia's position became precarious, her reputation tarnished. Clients began pulling out, and her carefully curated image of success began to crumble. Step 2. Social isolation. Julia thrived on her social connections. Her charm and charisma had always been her greatest weapons, allowing her to manipulate those around her. But now, with the truth exposed, those connections became liabilities. I reached out to the people she had hurt, friends, family members, former lovers, and shared what I had learned. Not everyone believed me at first, but the evidence spoke for itself. Slowly, her social circle began to shrink. Friends she had relied on for support turned their backs, unwilling to be complicit in her lies any longer. The invitations stopped. The phone calls dwindled. Julia, once the center of attention, found herself on the outside looking in. Step 3. The final blow. By now, Julia was reeling. Her professional life was in shambles, her social network in ruins. But there was one last piece of her life I needed to dismantle. Her relationship with Greg. Greg was a pawn, just as I had been. But he deserved to know the truth. I met him in person, armed with the evidence Allison and I had gathered. I told him everything, Not just about Julia's betrayal with me, but about the other men, the lies, the manipulations. At first, he was defensive, unwilling to believe that the woman he had fallen for could be so deceitful. But as I laid out the facts, I saw the realization dawn on him. Greg left her that night. He called Allison to apologize, admitting his role in the affair and promising to make amends. It was a small victory, but it was enough to close that chapter. Aftermath. Julia tried to rebuild. She attempted to play the victim, spinning tales of betrayal and persecution, but no one was listening. Her lies had caught up with her, and there was no escaping the consequences. For me, the process of dismantling her life was cathartic, but it wasn't the end of my journey. Revenge had given me closure, but it hadn't healed the wounds she left behind. That was something I had to do on my own. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding, not out of anger, but out of a desire to move forward. Therapy, new hobbies, and reconnecting with friends helped me rediscover who I was before Julia's betrayal. Slowly, I began to find peace. As for Julia, I don't know where she is now. Maybe she's still trying to rebuild, or maybe she's finally learned to face the truth about herself. Either way, she's no longer my concern. The storm had passed, and though it left scars, it also left me stronger. Revenge had been the means to an end, but the real victory was reclaiming my life, free from the shadow of her deceit. Revenge for betrayal. A web of consequences. The fallout from Julia's exposure left a profound silence in my life, a space where her deceit had once festered. But that silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before the final reckoning, a moment to reflect and prepare for the next chapter of this saga. Julia had stolen years of trust, happiness, and stability. While I had struck significant blows to her life, I couldn't shake the sense that she hadn't truly felt the weight of her actions. That reckoning was still to come. I wasn't done. Yet. Step 4. The public unveiling. Julia's world revolved around appearances. Even with her career faltering and her social network in tatters, she clung desperately to the illusion of control. Public perception was her last fortress, and I intended to breach it. I knew she still maintained an active online presence, carefully curating her life for her followers. She posted pictures of herself at charity events, motivational quotes about resilience, and updates about exciting new ventures that no longer existed. It was all a facade, and I decided it was time to dismantle it. Using an anonymous account, I began releasing snippets of the evidence I had gathered. Photos, messages, and timelines that painted a damning picture of her double life. Each post was crafted to raise questions, to force her followers and admirers to see the cracks in her carefully maintained image. I didn't reveal everything at once. Instead, I let the truth drip out, one piece at a time, creating a slow, agonizing unraveling of her reputation. The reaction was swift and brutal. Comments flooded her posts, asking for explanations, accusing her of hypocrisy and exposing their own stories of betrayal at her hands. Julia tried to fight back, issuing vague denials and blocking dissenting voices, but the tide was too strong. The more she resisted, the more people dug into her past, uncovering even more skeletons in her closet. Step 5. The legal angle. In the midst of this chaos, I discovered something unexpected. Julia had been engaging in shady financial dealings. Hidden bank accounts, unreported income, and questionable transactions suggested she had been siphoning money from joint ventures and possibly even defrauding her own company. It was a discovery I hadn't planned for, but it was an opportunity I couldn't ignore. I compiled the evidence and sent it to the appropriate authorities, including her company's board of directors. The legal process was slow, but the consequences were inevitable. Investigations were launched, assets were frozen, and Julia found herself facing lawsuits and potential criminal charges. Her carefully constructed life was collapsing, piece by piece. Step 6. The personal closure revenge had consumed me for months, and while each step brought a sense of vindication, it also left me emotionally drained. I realized that my obsession with Julia's downfall had kept me tethered to her, even as I tried to break free. If I was ever going to move on, I needed to let go, not of justice, but of the anger that had fueled me. I sought therapy, not to forget what had happened, but to understand it and grow from it. I wanted to ensure that Julia's betrayal didn't define me, that I could rebuild my life with the lessons I had learned. Slowly, I began to focus on myself, on healing and finding happiness outside of the shadow she had cast over my life. Julia's final fall. The last I heard of Julia, she had left the city, her reputation in ruins. She was facing multiple lawsuits, estranged from her friends and family, and struggling to rebuild a life that had been exposed as a lie. Her charm and manipulation had carried her far, but in the end, they couldn't save her from herself. For me, revenge had been a means to an end, a way to find closure and justice. But it wasn't the ultimate answer. The true victory lay in reclaiming my life, in rediscovering who I was without her influence. Julia's betrayal had been a painful chapter, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was merely the beginning of a new one, a story of resilience, growth, and a determination to never let betrayal define me again. Revenge for betrayal. The endgame months had passed since the storm of revelations, and life had finally begun to quiet down. Yet the weight of Julia's betrayal still lingered in the shadows, a reminder of the years she had stolen from me. I had unraveled her world piece by piece, exposing her lies and dismantling the facade she had so carefully constructed. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained undone. This wasn't just about her downfall. It was about reclaiming my sense of justice and balance. It was about ensuring she couldn't rise again to hurt someone else the way she had hurt me. I realized there was one last move to make, the final chapter in this tale of reckoning. The perfect trap Julia had always been a creature of habit, and her arrogance was her blind spot. Despite everything, she still clung to the belief that she could outmaneuver anyone who challenged her. That arrogance was the key to my plan. Through careful observation, I discovered she had taken to frequenting a new circle of influential people in a desperate attempt to rebuild her network. These were individuals she hoped to charm into alliances, people with power and wealth she could exploit to claw her way back. What she didn't realize was that I had already infiltrated this circle, a mutual acquaintance, a former colleague, who owed me a favor, helped me gain access. I fed small, seemingly innocuous pieces of information about Julia to this group, planting seeds of doubt about her motives and integrity. At the same time, I crafted an opportunity too tempting for her to resist, a lucrative but entirely fabricated business deal that would require her to invest heavily up front. With the help of my ally, the plan was set in motion. The confrontation. Night of the deal's culmination was orchestrated to perfection. Julia arrived at the upscale hotel where the meeting was set to take place, her confidence radiating despite the turmoil of recent months. She was dressed to impress, her smile as sharp as ever. But there was a flicker of desperation in her eyes, a hint of the cracks beneath her polished exterior. I watched from a distance, hidden among the other attendees. As the meeting began, the deal unfolded exactly as planned. Julia believing. She had secured a new foothold in the world of power and influence, committed herself fully. She signed documents, made promises, and even transferred an initial sum of money to secure her place in the fictitious venture. Then came the reveal. My ally, playing their part perfectly, stood and addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed any further, There's something you should all know about Ms. Julia Bennett. They proceeded to lay out the truth, her history of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal. Evidence was presented. Emails, photos, financial discrepancies, all meticulously documented. The room fell silent as the weight of the revelations sank in. Julia's face turned pale, then red. She tried to defend herself, but her words stumbled under the pressure of the evidence. The influential individuals she had hoped to charm began to withdraw, their disdain palpable. Her last lifeline had been severed. Aftermath in the weeks that followed, Julia disappeared from the public eye. The final blow had left her reputation irreparably damaged, her finances depleted, and her network of enablers dismantled. She was, for the first time, truly alone. As for me, the endgame brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected. It wasn't about her destruction. It was about reclaiming my power and ensuring that justice was served. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a freedom I hadn't known in years. Moving forward, with the chapter of revenge closed, I turned my attention fully to rebuilding my life. Therapy, new connections, and a focus on personal growth became my priorities. I learned to trust again, though cautiously, and to embrace the possibilities of a future untainted by Julia's betrayal. Revenge had been a necessary path, but it wasn't my destination. The true victory was in my ability to rise above the pain and find peace in the aftermath. Julia's story was over, but mine was just beginning. A story of resilience, hope, and the power of reclaiming one's narrative. I had faced the storm and emerged stronger. Now it was time to let the sunlight in. The cheating unfolds. Again, a déjà vu of betrayal life had started to regain a semblance of normalcy after the storm of Julia's previous betrayal, or so I thought. There's a strange calm that comes after a hurricane, a deceptive tranquility that makes you believe the worst is over. But sometimes that calm hides another storm brewing just over the horizon. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Julia had worked hard to convince me and everyone around us that she was a changed woman, someone who had learned from her mistakes, and for a time, I let myself believe her. We weren't together anymore, but I had maintained a cautious civility, for the sake of appearances, shared connections, and my own peace of mind. What I didn't know was that the betrayal wasn't over. It was simply taking a different form. The signs reappear. It started with the small things, Julia's tendency to disappear at odd hours under the guise of work meetings or networking events. She had taken to wearing her best outfits for these outings, her perfume lingering in the air like a taunt long after she left. Once, I spotted a text on her phone from a number saved as work contact, but the tone of the message, playful, overly familiar, was anything but professional. At first, I told myself I was overanalyzing. You've been through this before, I thought. Don't let paranoia get the best of you, but the gut knows what the heart wants to deny. Deep down, I recognized the patterns, the secretive behavior, the deflections when questioned, the subtle but undeniable emotional distance, a familiar pain. The confirmation came on a cold, quiet Tuesday evening. I hadn't meant to snoop. I had promised myself I wouldn't. But when her laptop chimed with a notification as she left the room, curiosity got the better of me. I clicked, and there it was. An email thread, intimate and unmistakably damning. The exchange wasn't just flirtatious. It was explicit, filled with plans for clandestine meetings and fond recollections of previous encounters. My chest tightened, the room spinning around me. I had been here before, standing at the edge of a precipice I thought I'd left behind. The pain wasn't new, but it was no less sharp, no less gut-wrenching. How could she do this again? After everything, confrontation. That evening, I confronted her. She returned home, her smile bright and disarming, as if she had no idea what I had discovered. "Julia," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "We need to talk." Her expression faltered just for a moment, a flicker of unease before she recovered her composure. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone laced with feigned concern. I placed her laptop on the table, the incriminating emails open for her to see. "Explain this." Her face turned pale, her eyes darting between the screen and me. "I can explain," she began, but the excuses that followed were hollow and desperate, a tangled web of half-truths and deflections. She blamed stress, loneliness, even me, as if her betrayal was somehow my fault. "I forgave you once," I said, my voice breaking. "I gave you the benefit of the doubt, trusted that you had changed. But this is who you are." She tried to reach for me, tears streaming down her face, but I stepped back. The betrayal was too raw, too deep. This isn't love, I thought. This is manipulation. The decision that night, I made a choice. There would be no more second chances, no more attempts to salvage something irreparably broken. Julia's betrayal had cut too deep, and I couldn't allow her to continue this cycle, not to me, and not to anyone else. I filed for legal action the next day, ensuring a clean break from the toxic entanglement she had woven. I reached out to those she had wronged, sharing the truth of her actions so they could protect themselves. This time, I wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. Healing and moving forward. The journey to healing was longer this time, the scars of her repeated betrayal running deeper than before. But I refused to let her actions define me. Therapy became my anchor, helping me process the pain and rebuild my sense of self. I leaned on friends and family, their unwavering support a reminder that I wasn't alone. Julia's betrayal was a dark chapter in my life, but it wasn't the end of my story. Slowly, I began to rediscover myself, my passions, and my strength. I vowed to never again let someone's lies overshadow my worth. As for Julia, her path was her own to walk. Whether she changed or continued down the same road was no longer my concern. My focus was on me, on building a future unshackled by her deceit. And so I turned the page, ready to write the next chapter of my life. One filled with hope, resilience, and the knowledge that no matter how deep the betrayal, I had the strength to rise above it.